It's really great to be after Sheila because I also want to talk about people power. But it's a bit intimidating to be after Sheila because my initiative has not had the impact, nearly the impact that hers has had. So, but hopefully, with your help, we can have more of an impact. So I'm not trained as a trialist. My first experience with analyzing clinical trial data was as a statistical consultant, which I do a bit of, particularly in the past few years. And I remember vividly the first meeting I had about a project that I was going to be involved in and was involved in. That the idea was that we were going to look and reevaluate the evidence for the efficacy of SSRIs, looking at clinical trial data. And I remember that meeting because the PhD student that I was working with, who this was their project, had a big spreadsheet of clinical trials, and there were a bunch of gaps in it. Trials that we knew happened, but we only knew that they were probably negative because we didn't have the results. And then even the ones that were published, we couldn't necessarily get the data to. And this was something that was puzzling to me because I thought, well, I know that in academic cognitive psychology, there's a data sharing and openness problem, but surely in clinical trials, because it's such an important thing, surely transparency is the norm. And I was very surprised that it wasn't. So at some point in the past few years, I was reviewing a paper, and I thought, I would really like to see this data, and I'd like others to be able to see this data, but I don't know, the journal I was reviewing for didn't have a policy on this, and I didn't know what I could do as an individual researcher to change the norms of the field. And that's how this initiative was born. I wanted to have an impact myself along with other people. And so the idea behind the Peer Reviewers Openness Initiative is that it is a collective action of reviewers in order to increase transparency in published research. So that's a bit of the background. So let me first begin by talking about this famous Isaac Newton quote, "The shoulders of giants." And I have this piece of art that I hope you can see from back there. It's a portrait of a person, but it's actually made up of lots of individual people, and we think of this quote by Isaac Newton as that we stand on the shoulders of giants as if science is a matter of people standing on individuals or individual work, but it's actually not the way it works, right? We are together are networks of people that all together we form science, and we're standing on one another's shoulders, which is a bit of a strange image, right? But that's how things are, right? We work with one another. When we do an experiment, when we do a trial, all of the things that we know, or 99% of the things that we know that enabled us to get there, we learned from other people. And this is just a fact. So we don't really stand on the shoulders of giants when we do science. We're holding together with one another. So I want to say that the BMJ has been particularly good on this this issue of open data. So. So here, this is all the way back in 2012. The BMJ in an editorial said, "It's no longer possible to pretend that a report of a clinical trial in a medical journal is enough to allow full independent scrutiny of the results." And I think this is true not just of clinical trials, but of any science, right? The idea that the people publishing a paper in a journal are the only ones that ever get to interpret the data underlying that result. That's a really weird idea, right? Data it should be rich. We know that people can make mistakes. We know that they can have tunnel vision. You can't rely on just the report that's published in a scientific paper to evaluate the results of a clinical trial or any other piece of scientific work. And the editorial goes further and says, if research is to help doctors and patients, it must be reliable and reproducible, but these are qualities that the current peer review process cannot assure. And so that's going to be the focus of this paper, the peer review process. What can we do to improve openness in the peer review process? But for those of you that follow these things, particularly on social media, you may have seen another editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine on data sharing about 2 years ago or so. It was just called simply data sharing, but it's now known as the research parasite editorial. So this just caused a sort of uproar of both weird fascination and consternation on the internet. It said a few things. It had to do with concerns about data sharing, and there were two major ones. First, that someone not involved in the collection of the data, in the generation and collection of the data, may not understand the choices made, and hence may not analyze the data optimally, and even the editorial goes on to say, may try to disprove what was said in the paper. Now, of course, this is all true. I think that you have a lot of faith if you think that the people who did the primary analysis also did the analysis properly, but it is what it is. The second is how this editorial got its name. The concern that the system will be taken over by what some researchers have characterized as research parasites. That is, a class of people who go around analyzing other people's data and benefiting from that. Now, for those of us who do statistical consulting, this was sort of baffling. It's like, well, why wouldn't you want somebody to look at your data and analyze it in a different way? Isn't that, don't you want other people to check mistakes? Don't you want other people to get something out of your data? Didn't the patients that or the subjects in your trial, wouldn't they want your research to have as much impact as possible? This is such a strange idea, but it's nonetheless prevalent. Now, there was progress on this, luckily. Recently, actually the BMJ published this same editorial. The ICMJE said that actually we believe that there's an ethical obligation to responsibly share data. So this was a really, in my opinion, a big step. But they don't yet mandate data sharing, but editors may take into consideration data sharing statements when making editorial decisions. This is really great because all of the journals that are covered by the ICMJE are now saying, look, this is something that we can consider in the peer review process, which is really great. It's something that we want to happen. It's something that will happen. More transparency is inevitable, and so we want this to happen in the peer review process. So I think there's a growing sense that data sharing is a good thing, right? Data sharing, it has all kinds of benefits that we all understand. Now, it's not without difficulties. There are difficulties. You have anonymity, you have credit, you have all kinds of things that we need to address. It's true, but the benefits of data sharing are real and they need to be considered. But now, and this is the great thing, we live in a time where we can send data instantaneously nearly anywhere in the world, and we have a lot of storage, essentially unlimited storage. It's not really unlimited, but essentially unlimited storage to store data. I mean, we live in a really great time to be doing research. Sharing is technically feasible. This was not the case 50 years ago, but it is now. A lot of the resistance to sharing, I think, is just habit, because it wasn't easy before, but now we're in this new world where we can do it, right? So it's technically feasible now. We need to be thinking of transitioning to a place where we're doing this by default. It's increasingly required by funders, and it's increasingly required by journals, right? So this is really great, but does it actually happen? And the answer is not really. And this is true across science with some very specific counterexamples like genetics. This is a nice paper that was published in 2016 in BMJ Open. What they did was they went looking at papers from 2009 onward. They looked specifically at papers that indicated the availability of their data set somewhere. And that was 50 out of 157. Now, of interest to me was the fact that 6 articles in BMJ indicated that their data was publicly available, and it turned out that only one of those data sets was still accessible. And then, out of the ones that said data is available via email upon request, only 6 out of the 38 shared their data. So then for clinical trials that were actually bound by the BMJ's data sharing policy, that is, they were supposed to do this. They were bound by this policy. Only 24% of those data sets could be obtained. Now, that's really not surprising to me, given what I've seen in other fields, but it does suggest that there's a problem. The data available upon request model doesn't work terribly well. Particularly with research done not by companies, but by academics, because, well, there's all kinds of reasons. Academics move. They move universities. When an academic moves from one university to another, their email address goes in something like a month, right? You may have your email address for a month, and if you're the corresponding author on that article, then your email address goes dead. You may leave academia. Academics are also very busy. We do a lot of things, and when an email comes in saying, hey, can you send me your data? That might go at the bottom of your priority list, right? You have a lot of other things to do. Academics are not specialists in keeping data, right? That's not something that we know how to do, right? We're not IT people. We don't know how to make our data safe and backed up in the best way, right? We're not specialized in this, and it shows because data disappears. It just evaporates. The half-life of research data is only a few years. This is really a concern, particularly for the hundreds of thousands of people that are involved in this research. To think that the possibly months or years that they spend doing some sort of trial, being involved in some sort of trial, is just going to evaporate. That data is going to evaporate. I think that's pretty disturbing. Now, it's not, academics don't do this on purpose, right? It just happens because this isn't what we're thinking about as a priority. Now, academics can also, oddly, make unreasonable demands, even contrary to a data sharing policy, in in response to the data request. So, for instance, I'll give you the data if you pay me for the time that it takes me to do this, or you have to put me on as an author on the paper, and I have to be able to see and comment on, and I get veto power over what you say about my data. These sort of things, they happen, and this is not a sign of a healthy culture, I think. But also, just in a very subtle way, academics can play favorites, right? A big name asks for your data, you're going to be more likely to share it. You're going to pay attention to their email more, and you just in general are going to be more likely to ignore somebody who maybe from a university that you don't know about. Maybe from another country, right? Academics play favorites, not always consciously, and this is not right. This should not happen. There's a power dynamic that we need to recognize, that some people are going to have access to data under the data available upon a reasonable request model, and other people will not. Data are often not available upon request, even when the policy says that it should be. So can we rely on journal policy? I don't think so. Journal policy is great. It's necessary. I'm very happy that some journals are changing their policy to require open science. This is a great thing. But I don't think it should be the thing that we all rely on for open science. I don't think that we should be relying on the funders to do these things, right? I think that we need to go beyond this. And why? So why? Well, first of all, journal policy isn't uniform, right? So we want these things to happen. We want open science to happen, but not all journals require it. So a journal can be really great, and then another journal can have a policy or no policy at all, right? Journal policy isn't uniform. So we can't just say journal policy is what we're going to rely on to push open science forward. Journal policy is also, it turns out, difficult to really enforce when it comes down to it. Because what is a journal going to do if it turns out that somebody has violated the data sharing policy that was in place when their paper was published? What are they going to do? There's a few things that they can do. In reality, they can issue a statement of concern, which has no teeth. It's just a statement of concern. Then they have the nuclear option, right? The nuclear option is retraction of an article. Now, I don't know about you, but if I were an editor-in-chief, I would be very, very reluctant to use the nuclear option just because data was not available, unless there were some other circumstances. Maybe this is what we should be doing, but I mean, it's understandable that this is a very, very serious sanction for an article. And it has been done, right? It has been done. When data disappears, the articles have been retracted. But this is often in the presence of there being some mistake that was found, and then it can't be confirmed, right? So it's difficult to really enforce journal policy without extreme measures, I think. But also, journal policy isn't sufficient, right? It's fairly slow to change, and it may not go far enough. So I'm going to argue that relying on journal policy is not just unwise, because it doesn't go far enough, but it's also a dereliction of the reviewer's responsibility, because the reviewers, the peer reviewers, are the ones that are the primary evaluators of the quality of science. So why would we abdicate this role to journal policy? In particular, because journal policy, journals have all kinds of interests that are not purely scientific, right? But we, as peer reviewers, are the ones who are supposed to be responsible for deciding whether this is a good scientific report or not. So actually, I would argue that we should be the ones doing this. We should not be relying on journal policy. And I'm not the only one who thinks this. So this is a very nice quote from the National Academy of Sciences about upholding community standards and how it is actually everybody's responsibility involved in the scientific process. The act of publishing is a quid pro quo in which authors receive credit and acknowledgement in exchange for disclosure of their scientific findings. An author's obligation is not only to release data and materials to enable others to verify or replicate published findings, as journals already implicitly or explicitly require, but also to provide them in a format on which other scientists can build with further research. All members of the scientific community, whether working in academia, government, or commercial enterprise, have equal responsibility for upholding community standards as participants in the publication system, and all should be equally able to derive benefits from it. So we're all responsible for this, particularly peer reviewers, I think. And it's just a matter of tradition and habit that we don't address these typically in review. Right? Open science issues we think of as being journal policy, and we don't address these issues in review. And I think there's a big reason for that is that sharing data has been difficult. And so the way we learn to do peer review may have been in an environment where data sharing wasn't done by default because it wasn't really possible. But now things have changed, so we need to rethink our responsibility as peer reviewers. So I think that many scientists, and polls actually bear this out, many scientists want to be more open. Scientists endorse the Mertonian norms, which of course include communalism at very high rates, right? If you ask people, do you think data sharing is a good thing, you will get high rates of agreement with that. I think most scientists understand at this point that data sharing is not only possible, it is a good thing. And even if they have concerns, they believe that those concerns can be addressed, and should be addressed, of course, but they can be addressed, right? Data sharing can happen. Now, if you ask people whether they want others to be open, well, of course. We all want others to be open because our research benefits when other people share their research data. There's no question about that. There are all kinds of reasons why we would want to see other people's research data. Not the least double checking, but also cumulative science, right? This is what we're supposed to be all about. Science is supposed to be a cumulative process. And the idea that we would allow the authors of an article to have sole access to the data for perpetuity is a very strange idea, because that research is supposed to be built upon. And when you look at a research article, often years of work, years of collecting data are boiled down to one test statistic. There's my T statistic. My T statistic is 3, P less than 0.05 or P less than 0.01, and that's it. That's what you get. So that's really quite, I think, surprising to a lot. When I talk to people who are not scientists about what I do, and I mention this, they're quite surprised that this is the case, but it's true. Also, meta-analysis, secondary analysis, training as well. Data sharing is really important for all of these things. We want other people to be open, but we are not open. This is a fact. We are not open, and we can do much better. So what we have here is a real social dilemma. I don't think that the problem is people being nefarious about this. I think we have just a very traditional social dilemma. We value openness. as scientists, of course, we say this is a value. Transparency is a scientific value. As evaluators and consumers of research, we want openness. We want openness not just for ourselves, but also for other consumers of the data, right? But for people who are going to need to make decisions about their own or others' treatment. We want openness, right? When I had laser eye surgery done, and I went to the literature and I looked to see what research had been done on the potential dangers of getting laser eye surgery, and whether I was going to end up, whether there was a 5% or a 2% or a 1% chance of me going blind. Now I don't know anything about that, but I wanted to go to the research literature and I wanted to find out. Now, I didn't know at the time how much research is actually hidden, but I would have really liked to know that, and I would have really liked to know all the work that had been done before I made that decision. It turned out it was all right, but we want openness for ourselves and others. But as authors, the incentives are different, right? This is where the social dilemma kicks in. We may not feel that it's in our best interest to be open at that point in our role as authors. And there are all kinds of reasons for this. Openness might not be reciprocated. We may enable a research parasite situation where the benefits of openness are mostly for others and not for us. And that may put us at some sort of competitive disadvantage if other people are not equally open, or if they're not generating data that's useful to us, if they're just analyzing our data, right? But also, openness takes time. I mean, there's no question that de-anonymizing a data set, putting it in a format that is going to make sense to other people, right? Finding a place for it online, working out how you're possibly going to restrict access to it, because you can't just share everything, publicly at least. Working all of these things out, it takes time. There's no question about this. And then, of course, the incentives that a lot of people have in their day-to-day career have to do with funding and hiring. And openness is not necessarily rewarded in these situations, right? Now, we're getting to the point where funders are requiring this, and this is a really great thing. But in hiring, this is not the case, at least typically. We've seen more and more job ads where the job ad will say, please explicitly address what you've done regarding open science in your cover letter, but it's not typically required. So why would I spend all of this time? I'm at the point where I'm about to submit a paper. Why would I do that? Why would I spend all that time if it's not going to be rewarded, right? So I think we have just a typical social dilemma here. Nobody's evil. Nobody's bad. It's just, this is how things work. So our incentives are to publish faster, to avoid work that doesn't benefit us directly, to avoid possible embarrassment from mistakes. There's all kinds of incentives that we have, and I've heard all of these from people, and people will explicitly tell me, I am scared that somebody will find a mistake in this work, right? That's something that people explicitly tell me. We have an incentive, in some sense, to prevent that from happening. And unfortunately, that makes people reluctant to share their data. But as a reviewer, our incentives are different. As a reviewer, our incentive is to encourage better science in general, both for patients, for people involved in clinical trials, for the people that are going to consume that research. Our incentives are to encourage better science in general as a reviewer. We want to get others to share their data for us, because we might be able to use that data. If we're reviewing a paper, it's likely that we're in that field, and so we're going to want to, in some sense, benefit from the raw data, possibly at some point. Now, we also want to avoid extra review workload. This is going to become, you'll see why this is relevant in a minute or two. But we also want to see possible mistakes, right? We're reviewers, right? That's the whole point. So we would like to be able to see the raw data, and we'd like other people in the future to be able to see. And in some sense, this isn't the way we normally think about reviewing, but in some sense, as reviewers, we should be thinking of ourselves as the proxy for everybody who's going to consume that research in the future, right? Now, the authors have certain, they're playing a certain role, but you as the reviewer should be thinking, what are the consumers of this research going to be thinking about? What do they need? What do they want? The scientists who are reading it, the people who might have some sort of illness and want to evaluate a treatment. What do they need? What do they want? You as a reviewer are their proxy in the peer review process. That's your role. So what is the peer reviewer's openness initiative? The peer reviewer's openness initiative is meant to strike at that social dilemma, because I believe the reviewers have the responsibility and the incentives to encourage transparency. I think that is part of their role, and I think a lot of people feel the same way. They just don't do this in peer review because it's not something that's traditionally addressed. So what do you do with the Pro initiative? When you receive a review request, what you do is you agree to it, if you're going to agree to it, and you look at the paper to see whether it addresses the openness of the data set and any materials that it makes sense to share. And then you immediately ask the authors through the editor. You go to the editor and you say, are these data going to be open? And if not, are you going to justify it in the paper? Are you going to say, for all the readers of this paper and for the reviewers, are you going to say why this stuff is not available? You just need a reason. And if the answer is either the editor says, no, I'm not going to contact the authors, or the authors say, no, we're not going to do that, then you do what's called a non-comprehensive review. You're still reviewing the paper, you're just doing it non-comprehensively. I'll show you what that means in a second. If it's yes, if the answer is yes, then you go on with your review as normal. So that's the idea. And this started in January of 2017. We have 500 signatories so far who are doing this, and I'll show you some of the impacts. But that's the idea. You just ask about openness as soon as you get as soon as you approve the review request. Will the authors openly provide the data underlying the paper on publication at a third-party repository? And this is important. This is important. It's got to be a third-party repository because otherwise data evaporates, right? We know this. Data evaporates. Maybe you have an institutional repository, that's good, but somebody else should be managing it, not you. And if not, will they justify that decision? And this is really crucial, because if you just give a reason, any reason at all, then it satisfies the requirements of this. It just has to be in the paper. But if you give any reason, and so for us, this is a really fascinating part. Sheila also mentioned this. We want to know what people say. So, if they say, well, we're just too lazy to put this on a third-party repository, we want to know that, right? We're happy if you say that. If you put it in the paper, fine. We just want to know. So that's really important. Any public justification will do. Any public justification. So what is non-comprehensive review? You say something like this. I'm not going to completely review this paper because this paper lacks something that I think is critical in a scientific report. That is the data or justification of why the data is not there. It's lacking something that is necessary. And so I would be happy to review a corrected version of this manuscript, but as it stands, I don't think it meets the quality standards that I set, and so that's all I have to say. And so the idea is that you strike at what journals need. One of the things that journals need most. They need reviewers and they need papers. And anybody who's an editor at this point knows reviewers are hard to come by. You have a tremendous amount of leverage as a reviewer in this process, and you should use that, I think. So we have a paper about this that you can do a quick search. It's published in Royal Society Open Science that addresses some of the potential critiques of this idea and outlines it. We have a website where you can sign up and either publicly say that you're going to do this, because this is all about collective action. If any reviewer did this by themselves, editors would just ignore it. But the power of this happens because it's a collective action. You say, I'm doing this with other people. And you'd be surprised at how people respond differently to, I'm just not going to do this, as opposed to me and several hundred other people have decided that we're going to do this. They respond to it very differently. There's also an app that was put together by Tom Hardwick at Stanford that helps you keep track of your reviews. So you can go in, you can register a paper in the interface, and it will generate for you a non-comprehensive review that's appropriate to the situation, so it's quite convenient. It helps you keep track of these things. So I'm going to save the possible critiques for the question and answer time, but let me just review them pretty quickly. Some people think that it would be hypocritical of them to call others out in the review process if their research is not open. Some people are concerned that the standards aren't there yet for how to share data. Some authors are concerned that maybe people don't know how to, some reviewers are concerned that maybe authors don't know how to open their data, right? These aren't skills that people have. Of course, there are ethical, legal, and practical reasons why somebody might not share their data. But again, just give a reason. That satisfies it. Another thing that people say is that they can't check all the analyses and review, and that's totally true. This is not about the reviewers having access to the data necessarily, although that's good. This is about the consumers, the later consumers of the research having access to the data. And also, some people are concerned that PRO might be used aggressively against people, although we haven't seen any evidence of that. I want to quickly say that we found the major hurdle here is actually editors. Editors don't like this. Editors explicitly think that this is usurping their proper role to decide these things on behalf of the journal. Now, authors, so I hear from a lot of people who have done this, and authors typically don't have a problem with this. It's editors who say, you know, I'm not going to send this. I'm not going to send this to the authors. And this is actually an editor quote. We do not think that reviewers should have the right to impose their own preferred rules onto the journal's procedure. And, well, I don't think this is right. If you look at, for instance, the COPE guidelines, the guidelines say that reviewers should read the manuscript, the ancillary material, and so forth, getting back to the journal if anything is not clear and requesting any missing or complete items they need to carry out a full review. And I think that this is just, this is just a case where reviewers are doing just this. And actually, I would say, I don't think that journals should have the right to impose their preferred rules on reviewers. Reviewers are doing this for free, and they have the right to say, these are my values, these are what I think that good science is, and if you don't want my full review, you don't have to have it. But these are the conditions. So just very briefly, because I have only a minute, has Pro changed anything? And we've had some effects. We've actually, that you'd be surprised at how effective it can be just to send one of these messages to an editor who doesn't expect it. I gave you a negative response just now, but also we've had some positive responses. For instance, this is an example with the journal Mindfulness. The editor-in-chief said, oh, you know what? We need to consider this, and we're going to put in our author guidelines that people should think about this, definitely. So it raises the discussion, and I know this now because at the time I came up with the Pro Initiative, I was not on the editorial board of any journal, but I was when it came into effect. And so I have seen these internal discussions that have been that have happened because reviewers have said, no, I'm not going to do this unless I get the data or a reason. And it causes people to talk about things. So I'm going to skip, in the interest of getting to the questions, I'm going to skip and just say that so I can wrap up, that I think really the fundamental relationship in science is between peers. And to the extent that journals use their policy to prevent communications between authors and reviewers about these issues, I think that hinders science. I think it's detrimental to science. And this is part of what we should be doing as reviewers. We should be putting these principles that we believe in into practice, both for our own benefit and for the benefit of people who are going to need to consume this science. So, just to conclude, openness is desirable, but the uptake is slow. This is a fact. And journals and funders are an important part of this story, but they're only part of it. And as reviewers, we need to think about this, because they can be, we can be a potent force for change, acting collectively, as you do with the Pro Initiative. So that's all I have. Thank you.